The ruthless Mafia boss who had brought men to their knees was brought to his own tonight, not by enemies, not by betrayal, but by his own son's cries. Jiho stood in the centre of his penthouse, a man whose very name made the city tremble. In every corner of Seoul, his word was law, his empire an unbreakable fortress. Fear followed him like a shadow, and power clung to him like a second skin. No one dared to challenge Kang Jiho, the Mafia king who ruled with cold precision. But tonight, his world was falling apart. The baby's scream was relentless, so sharp, so painful. Every second of it sliced through his composure, ripped through his control. It echoed in his head like a haunting scream in the dark. His son, Juno, just 3 months old, was wailing, his tiny body trembling with desperation. 6 hours. The cry wouldn't stop. Juno was helpless until a black woman from a women's shelter, with nothing but her compassion, did what his vast wealth couldn't. She cradled his son against her chest, singing a soothing, timeless melody, and breastfed him back to health. What Jiho never anticipated was that saving his son would demand everything from him. Jiho had killed men without hesitation, orchestrated wars, manipulated deals worth billions, and destroyed families to build his empire. He had done it all. But in this moment, with his son's piercing cry ringing in his ears, Jiho realized something he had never felt before: helplessness. He walked the length of his penthouse, his perfectly tailored suit wrinkled and damp from the sweat pooling at the back of his neck. His cold eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were clouded with frustration. He tried everything. The best doctors, the most expensive formulas, nothing worked. He had everything a man could want, except for peace. What is wrong with you, he thought, his hand shaking as he bounced his son gently against his shoulder. What am I doing wrong? Drop a comment below with your thoughts. What do you think will happen next? Don't forget to like, share and subscribe so you don't miss stories like this. And hey, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Stay tuned for more action, emotional twists and jaw-dropping moments. His empire, his entire life, had been built on control, on making the world bend to his will. But this tiny baby in his arms, crying and screaming for 6 hours, was something he could not control. His mind raced, a hurricane of thoughts. I'm the most powerful man in this city. I'm untouchable, and yet I can't even make my son stop crying. The phone buzzed in his pocket. The council is questioning your leadership. Jiho froze. His eyes flickered down to the screen, the words on the text, nothing more than a cruel reminder that his enemies were closing in. They smelled blood. His empire, his world, everything he had worked for was slipping. He stared at the message, the words swimming in front of his eyes. His fingers hovered over the screen. His baby's cry was the only thing he could hear. Jiho's jaw clenched. He tossed the phone aside. The council could wait. His son could not. With trembling hands, Jiho grabbed his keys. He didn't care about the meeting. He didn't care about the Mafia Council. He didn't care about the empire he'd spent years building. The only thing that mattered now was his son. His empire had crumbled in the face of a tiny, helpless cry. Across the city, a different world existed, a world that Jiho never cared to notice, a place far from the violence and the riches he had come to dominate. It was a world that didn't need money, didn't need power, just compassion. The Han River Women's Shelter. Jiho parked his black Bentley in the shadows across the street, his son still wailing in the back seat. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him, the suffocating pressure of not knowing what to do next. He had people for everything. He had men who answered to him. He had doctors, lawyers, mercenaries, whatever he needed. But nothing had prepared him for this. He couldn't buy his way out of this. No amount of power or wealth could fix his son's pain. His eyes darted to the building, modest, humble, far from the glitzy cold marble halls of his empire. Inside, women came and went, their faces weary from surviving a world that had no place for them. Yet, for some reason, Jiho felt an unfamiliar pull. He didn't know why he was here. He didn't know what he was looking for. And then he saw her. Amina. She stood in the kitchen, her back to him as she stirred a pot. Tall, strong. Her movements were graceful, effortless, and yet every motion commanded respect. Her presence filled the room in a way Jiho couldn't explain. She was different from anyone he had ever known. She turned, and their eyes met. There was no fear, no hesitation, just an unspoken understanding. Her eyes were calm but calculating, assessing him with a gaze that seemed to pierce through the walls he had built around himself. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Jiho's pulse quickened, but he pushed the feeling down. He didn't need to care about this woman. He didn't need to care about anything here. But his son was still crying. Without another thought, Jiho stormed toward the door. He kicked it open without a second thought, a force of habit that shook the quiet shelter. The women inside froze. But Amina? She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "You can't be here," she said, her voice firm, her accent unmistakably an African. Jiho stepped inside, ignoring the wary eyes on him. "I need help," he said, his voice strained, his desperation clear. "My son won't stop crying. I've tried everything. I'll pay anything." Amina didn't flinch. Instead, she moved closer to him, her calm demeanor unwavering. Her eyes shifted from Jiho to Juno, the baby still wailing in his arms. Without a word, she stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch the baby's back. "What's wrong with him?" Jiho's voice was low, broken. Amina didn't answer right away. She simply observed the baby, her hand warm and steady. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but sure. "He's not sick. He's starving for connection. Formula isn't what he needs." Jiho's brows furrowed. He had money. He had doctors. He had everything, yet no one had told him that. She continued, her voice soft but firm. "You're holding him, but are you really here with him?" Jiho hesitated, confusion clouding his mind. "What do you mean?" Amina's gaze never left him. "He needs warmth, a heartbeat, a human anchor. You've surrounded him with everything he could want, but you're not here. Not really. Babies feel that. They feel distance. They feel fear." Jiho's chest tightened. She was right. He had been holding his son physically, but his mind had been elsewhere, on the empire, on the meeting, on everything except the tiny person in his arms. For the first time in his life, Jiho felt vulnerable. Jiho stood frozen, his eyes locked onto Amina's hand as it hovered over his son's back. Every second stretched, the tension thickening the air between them. His mind raced. Was she some sort of healer? A fraud? Or was she simply a woman with no idea of what she was dealing with? Juno's cries filled the room, echoing off the walls, but Jiho felt the shift. The energy in the air seemed to change. The wild desperation of the baby's wails softened, if only by the smallest degree. It was almost imperceptible, but Jiho felt it. He couldn't explain why. Amina looked up at him, her eyes still calm, unflinching. "He's not sick," she repeated, her voice low, almost soothing. "He's hungry for something more than formula. Babies don't need much, just warmth, a connection, skin to skin, a heartbeat they can hear, feel. He doesn't need doctors. He needs a mother's touch." Jiho felt his chest tighten. The walls he'd carefully constructed around himself were starting to crack. "I've tried everything," he muttered, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. It sounded weak to him, but it was the truth. Money had never failed him before. Why was it failing him now? Amina didn't respond immediately. She just glanced at the baby once more, then back at him. There was no pity in her gaze, no sympathy, only understanding, a knowing that Jiho couldn't yet comprehend. Her hand stayed on Juno's back, moving gently in slow circles. The room felt smaller. The walls seemed to close in, pressing down on Jiho. The sound of Juno's cries was the only thing he could hear, louder now, more frantic, as though the baby could sense his father's uncertainty. "Pick him up," Amina said quietly, her voice commanding yet gentle. "Hold him the way you should, with your heart in it, and stop thinking about the empire. Forget your meetings. Forget your council. Forget everything for a moment. Just be with him." Jiho stood there, frozen, unable to move. His hands gripped the baby tighter, but not in the way Amina meant. It was mechanical, impersonal. He held the child like a burden, not like a father should. "I don't know how to do this," he thought. For the first time in his life, Jiho was not in control, not of the situation, not of the crying baby, not of the strange woman before him. He was a king, a warlord, a master of his fate. Yet none of that mattered in this moment. He was as helpless as a child himself. Amina stepped closer, her presence so sure and calm that it cut through the tension in the room like a knife. She reached out slowly, her hands gentle but confident, as she placed one on Juno's back, the other resting on the baby's small head. Jiho didn't stop her. He had no words. What was there to say? He was the most feared man in Seoul, but in this moment he felt smaller than he ever had. Amina's voice softened, her eyes still locked onto his. "The world outside doesn't matter right now. This little boy needs you to be present, not just physically, but with your heart. He needs you to be his father, Jiho." Jiho didn't know how to respond. He wasn't sure he even had an answer. All he knew was the weight of his son's cries and the strange pull Amina had on him. His hand, which had been gripping the baby with what felt like desperation, began to soften. He shifted Juno in his arms, and as his son's cries began to wane, Jiho felt something stir deep inside him, something he had buried for years, a sense of tenderness, of responsibility, that had always been buried beneath the cold steel of his life. For a brief moment the baby's wailing ceased altogether. The silence between them was thick with something Jiho couldn't quite name. Amina didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her calmness was enough. And in that moment, Jiho understood that there was more to being a father than money, power, or control. It wasn't something he could buy or dictate. Juno settled into his arms, his cries slowing to a soft whimper. The baby's small hands, which had been balled into tight fists, slowly began to open. Jiho held him close, his breath shallow and uncertain. He could feel his son's warmth against his chest, the tiny breaths that came slower now. Amina's words rang in his mind. He needs warmth. He needs a connection. "Why did you help me?" Jiho asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know why he was asking, but it was the question that had been eating at him ever since he walked through the door. Amina's eyes softened, but her answer was simple. "Because he's your son, and no matter how much you think you know, no amount of money or power can replace the love he needs." Jiho felt the weight of her words sink deep into his chest. The empire he'd fought for, the legacy of violence he'd carved out for himself, suddenly felt so distant, so small compared to the responsibility of this tiny life in his arms. He looked at her, this woman who had no fear of him, no reverence for the empire he had built. She wasn't intimidated by his power, but neither was she impressed by his wealth. She saw something else in him, something vulnerable, something real. He didn't know how to respond. Her presence was a strange mixture of warmth and defiance. She wasn't like the women he was used to. She didn't admire him. She didn't fear him. She simply existed. And that unnerved him, because it was the one thing that Jiho couldn't control. "You need to take care of him," Amina said, breaking his thoughts. "You can't do this alone. He's not a trophy for your empire, Jiho. He's a human being, and he needs you to be more than just his father. He needs you to be his protector." Jiho stared at her, unsure of what to say next. He had been so focused on controlling everything, on building his empire, that he hadn't stopped to think about what it meant to actually live in it. He was used to making threats, used to controlling everything with a look or a word. But this was different. This was real. This was his son. Jiho's throat tightened, his gaze falling to Juno, whose small body had finally gone still in his arms. The baby was no longer crying. In the quiet of the room, Jiho finally allowed himself to exhale, the tension in his body easing ever so slightly. But as the minutes passed, he realized something he wasn't ready to admit. He wasn't sure he knew how to be a father. He wasn't sure he knew how to be anything else. Here's the third batch of the story. With a seamless continuation of the emotional arc between Jiho and Amina. I've also included a call to action toward the end to keep viewers engaged. Jiho's heart was still racing, his breath shallow as he carefully adjusted Juno in his arms. The infant, once wailing with desperation, was now quiet, nestled against his chest. Jiho could feel the tiny heartbeat, a rhythmic pulse that reminded him that, despite all the chaos of his life, something pure, something fragile, was now entirely dependent on him. The air between him and Amina hung heavy with the weight of unspoken words. She had not asked for this. She had not wanted to become part of his world. And yet, here she was, a stranger in his kingdom, offering the one thing no amount of wealth or power could buy: peace. Amina stood a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest, watching him with an unreadable expression. Jiho knew she could see right through him, but for the first time in his life, he didn't mind. There was no judgment in her gaze, just an understanding that cut deeper than anything he'd ever experienced. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, he just nodded, unsure of how to express the overwhelming gratitude he felt, or how to even begin to thank her for what she had done. "I don't know how to do this," Jiho admitted quietly, his voice breaking slightly. Amina's expression softened, and for the first time since meeting her, there was a hint of compassion in her eyes. "You're not alone, Jiho. You don't have to do it all by yourself." She stepped closer, her voice steady. "But you have to decide. Are you going to protect him? Truly protect him?" Her words struck a nerve, sinking deep into Jiho's chest. Protect him. The phrase echoed in his mind, reverberating through his bones. Jiho had spent his life protecting his empire, through manipulation, violence, and control. But what did it really mean to protect his son? What did it mean to be the kind of father Juno needed? He didn't have the answers, and that uncertainty gnawed at him, deeper than any wound he had ever suffered. "I've built this empire with blood, with sweat. I've fought for everything," Jiho said, his voice thick with the weight of his choices. "But I don't know if I can protect him from what I've become." Amina's eyes never left him. "You don't have to protect him from yourself. You have to protect him from the world you've created. You're the only one who can decide which path you take from here." Jiho's gaze dropped to Juno, his tiny face now relaxed in peaceful sleep. He ran a hand gently over his son's head, the soft, downy hair calming him in a way he hadn't expected. He was holding the future in his arms, his blood, his legacy, and he was terrified. The sound of a car engine in the distance snapped Jiho from his thoughts. His body tensed, instinctively reaching for the Glock hidden at his side. But Amina's hand shot out to stop him before he could move. "Don't," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Not yet." Jiho looked at her, confusion flickering in his eyes. Amina's face remained unreadable. "You can't go back to what you were. Not with him. Not now." The car engine grew louder, and Jiho's attention flickered to the window. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the danger that always followed him, even in the most intimate moments of his life, the danger that lurked, ready to swallow everything whole. "Do you trust me?" Amina asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jiho hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. Trust. It was a currency Jiho had never been willing to spend, not even on his closest allies. But something in Amina's steady gaze, her unwavering calmness, made him reconsider. For the first time, he allowed himself to lower his guard, to look at her not as the woman in his way, but as the person who had helped him in his greatest moment of need. "Yes," Jiho said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I trust you." Amina nodded, her gaze softening. "Good, because we're about to face the consequences of your decisions. But we'll do it together." The sound of the engine outside stopped, followed by the unmistakable sound of car doors slamming shut. Jiho's hand instinctively moved to his side, where the weight of his weapon was a constant reminder of the world he lived in. But Amina stopped him again, her hand firmly on his wrist. "Not this time," she said. "Not here. Not now. You've been living in fear for so long, Jiho. But you have a choice. You can choose a different path, one where power doesn't have to come at the expense of love. Choose wisely." The tension in the room was palpable. Every moment felt suspended in time. Jiho stared at Amina, his mind a storm of confusion and realization. His world was shifting beneath him. The empire, the ruthlessness, it was all so clear now, so meaningless in the face of what truly mattered. The front door opened, and the sharp click of boots on the marble floor echoed through the penthouse. Jiho's chest tightened as he instinctively reached for his gun, but then he stopped. He looked at Amina, this woman who had just helped him in ways he couldn't even comprehend, and then at his son, his world, now peacefully resting in his arms. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Jiho realized that the biggest battle he would ever face was the one within himself. Are you hooked on Jiho's transformation? Drop a comment below with your thoughts. What do you think will happen next? Don't forget to like, share and subscribe so you don't miss stories like this. And hey, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Stay tuned for more action, emotional twists and jaw-dropping moments. The tension in the room thickened. Jiho's hand hovered over his Glock, his instincts screaming at him to protect his empire, to act as the ruthless leader he had been trained to be. But Amina's words echoed in his mind, demanding something more, something deeper. She had stripped away his control, forcing him to confront the part of him he'd buried, the part that cared, the part that wanted to protect something real. Jiho's heart beat heavily in his chest as he watched the door open, a familiar figure stepping inside, breaking the moment of stillness. The man was one of Jiho's closest men, a trusted underboss, but the look on his face was anything but reassuring. His eyes darted quickly around the room, landing on Jiho, then on Amina, before finally falling to the baby in Jiho's arms. "Boss?" the underboss started, his voice hesitant. "There's a problem. The council's getting restless, they're losing faith, and The Yakuza's been circling. They're ready to move. Jiho's body went stiff. He knew it was coming, the pressure, the betrayal, the alliances fracturing like glass. His empire had always been held together by fear, but fear had a shelf life. It was eroding. The cracks were showing, but he couldn't think about that now. Not while he was holding his son, not while Amina was in the room. His gaze flickered to Amina, and for a fleeting moment the walls around him crumbled. He wanted to ask for help. He wanted to know if she could offer him something more than what he had been clinging to for years. But she wasn't his ally in this world. She was something different, something far more dangerous. "Leave," Jiho commanded, his voice cold, masking the storm brewing inside him. "I'll deal with it. Get the others in line." The underboss hesitated. "But, sir—" "Now." The man shot a final glance at Amina before retreating, his footsteps echoing through the marble halls as the door slammed shut behind him. Amina's eyes met Jiho's, and for a long moment they just stared at each other. There was no judgment in her eyes, just understanding. It unnerved him. "You're a man of power, Jiho," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "But power doesn't mean control. You can't control everything, and that's something you'll have to accept." Jiho didn't answer. His jaw clenched, and he moved towards the window, his fingers gripping the cold glass as he looked out at the sprawling city. His empire, his kingdom. It had been built on the blood of others, and it was slowly slipping through his fingers. Amina walked up behind him, standing at a respectful distance, but her presence felt like an anchor in the chaos. "You want to protect your son?" Amina asked, her voice cutting through his thoughts. "Then protect him from this. Protect him from the empire you've built, because if you don't, it will destroy him." Jiho turned to face her, his eyes dark with unspoken emotions. "You don't know what you're asking." "I know exactly what I'm asking." Amina stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "You can't shield him from the world you've created. Not forever. So you have to decide, Jiho. Are you going to let him live in it? Or will you walk away from it for him?" The weight of her words hit him harder than any bullet ever could. Jiho closed his eyes, pressing his fingers against his temples. His mind raced. Walk away? Was it even possible? The empire, the deals, the power, it was all he had ever known. It was his life. But Juno needed something else. Jiho exhaled slowly, his gaze falling to his son, still nestled peacefully in his arms. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't asked for the responsibility of fatherhood, of caring for someone so vulnerable. But now that it was here, Jiho realized he couldn't escape it. Not anymore. Amina didn't wait for him to respond. She simply nodded, as if she had said everything that needed to be said. Her role in this moment was done, but Jiho knew that, in her own way, she had set something in motion that he couldn't stop. "I can't just walk away," Jiho said, his voice low and uncertain. "You don't have to," Amina replied, her tone surprisingly gentle. "But you can start with making the right choices for him. It won't be easy. But he deserves better than this world. He deserves better than the one you've created." The silence that followed was thick with possibility. Jiho stood there, torn between his old life and the new life he was being asked to create. The thought of leaving it all behind was unimaginable, an empire built on years of ruthless decisions, bloodshed, and manipulation. But the thought of letting his son grow up in that world, that was even harder to bear. Amina's gaze softened as she stepped back, giving him space. "I'll be here, but only if you're ready to choose him over everything else." The words hit Jiho like a slap. He didn't know if he was ready, but he knew this. He was no longer the man who could ignore his own son's cries. The man who had built his empire through violence and control had to face something he had never considered, what it meant to be a father. What do you think he'll do next? Will he walk away from his empire? Or will he continue down the path he's always known? Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Do you think Jiho can change? If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And hey, tell us where you're watching from. Your feedback means everything to us, and we can't wait to hear your predictions for what happens next. The silence in the room was deafening as Jiho stood there, his son cradled in his arms, the weight of the decision pressing down on him with every passing second. Amina had said her piece. She had given him the space to reflect, to confront the deep truth that had been buried in the back of his mind for years. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Jiho's empire, built on fear, violence, and manipulation, had given him everything he thought he needed, the power, the control, the fear that had made men bow before him. He had everything but the one thing that truly mattered, peace. A sudden rush of cold air swept through the room as Jiho turned his back to the window and walked toward the table that held his phone, a constant reminder of the life that waited for him beyond these walls. The notifications, the messages, the calls, it all seemed so distant now. His eyes flicked to the screen, but for the first time he didn't care about the numbers, the deals, or the people demanding his attention. The only thing that mattered was the tiny life in his arms. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't asked for the responsibility of fatherhood, of a son who depended on him for more than just money or power. But now, holding Juno, feeling the warmth of his son's tiny body against his chest, Jiho realized he couldn't ignore the responsibility anymore. For the first time in his life, Jiho understood the weight of love. Amina stood off to the side, her presence quiet but powerful. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She had already given him the space to make his choice, to come to the realization that would change everything. Jiho looked at her, his expression softening. He saw something in her he hadn't recognized before, strength, resilience, wisdom. A woman who had faced her own struggles, who had chosen to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. A woman who, despite the odds, had remained kind and unwavering in a world that could be cold and cruel. "I'm sorry," Jiho said, his voice thick with emotion. It was the first apology he had ever offered that wasn't forced, that wasn't about securing power or manipulating a situation. This one came from the heart, a raw, unfiltered admission of his own failures. Amina's gaze didn't waver. She simply nodded, her lips curling into a small, understanding smile. "You don't need to apologize to me. You need to apologize to him," she said, her voice soft but resolute. She gestured to Juno, still sleeping soundly in Jiho's arms. Jiho's throat tightened as he gazed down at his son. Apologize to him? The thought hadn't crossed his mind until now. He had always believed that power would fix everything, that money and control were all that was needed to provide for those who depended on him. But now, holding his son, Jiho realized how much more he had to give, how much more he had to learn. The tears threatened to rise, but Jiho held them back. The man who had never shown weakness, the man who had built his empire with blood and ruthlessness, was now faced with the raw vulnerability of fatherhood. It was a different kind of strength, one he hadn't known existed until now. "I'll make it right," Jiho said, his voice barely a whisper. Amina didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her calm presence was enough to give him the strength he needed to take the next step. Jiho stood there for a long moment, looking down at his son, then back at Amina. The room felt smaller now, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. But it didn't feel suffocating. For the first time in his life, Jiho felt like he could breathe. "I'm leaving it all behind," Jiho said finally, his voice steady. "I'll walk away from the empire, from the violence, from the deals, everything." Amina's expression softened, but she said nothing. Jiho wasn't sure what her reaction meant, but it didn't matter. The decision was his to make, and in that moment he knew it was the right one. Jiho walked towards the door, Juno still nestled in his arms, his tiny fingers curled around his father's shirt. He stepped into the hallway, his eyes scanning the familiar halls of his penthouse, knowing it would be the last time he would walk these halls as the man he had been. He glanced back at Amina, who was watching him with a quiet understanding. She had offered him the path, but it was he who had to take it. And now, as he stepped into the unknown, he was no longer the ruthless mafia boss. He was simply a father. Jiho looked down at his son one last time, his heart swelling with a new kind of love, a love that had the power to break him and rebuild him. He had made his choice,